Hey guys, welcome back. This was a historic week. Obviously, we're looking at a sequel. The Trump administration is coming back in, so I've got my good friend Chris Wall from Zeus Logics on, and we're going to talk a little bit about what we can expect. So, Chris, first, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah.
It's been, as you said, a very, very interesting week. But yeah, overall, interesting.
Yes, I think our family is feeling secure in our decision to move to Canada a couple months ago. I know you're living in France. So here you have two Americans who aren't living in America talking about what could happen. So maybe we're a little bit more objective, or maybe we're not. But I guess I want to get started by kind of my takeaway from the election is that I think it's not going to be as bad as people think. It's probably not going to be as good as people think as well. Just, given all of my experience with government and things that happen, it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. But, President Trump does have a very strong perspective on how he wants to reshape economics and trade policy and things like that. And I kind of want to start by looking backwards and understanding, we had 4 years of a Trump term, and there were a lot of things that were done. Some things stuck, some things didn't stick. And so I'd love to get your perspective first on what did the first Trump term do in terms of lasting impacts on international trade?
All right. The sort of the big overarching trend is that if you look, globalization was a huge trend from the early 90s until about 2017. And that big trend, the constant flow in one direction, that trend has been disrupted. And we've now are shifting or have shifted towards a multipolar, fragmented global economy with less confidence in positive sum outcomes. So while this shift might have been inevitable, sort of reflecting the historical cycle between liberalization and control over the global economy, it was Donald Trump who initiated the first major moves in this direction. He's the one who fired the first shots in the trade war. And that has really been, from that, everything has flowed.
Okay. That makes sense. I think, the Biden administration also chose not to roll back many of the tariffs that were put in place in the first Trump administration. I think they even added some tariffs. And so can you just talk to what were some of the things that were rolled back that you might think about what could maybe change in 5 years versus things that you think are going to be here longer term?
So there was a rolling back of tariffs and punitive measures taken against allies. The Biden administration was far more open to international cooperation and the U.S. playing a role in an international world order than the Trump administration was. So bringing the allies a little bit closer in was definitely a thing. And there, you did also see some exemptions from anti-dumping and countervailing duties for Chinese solar goods. But the overall tone remained the same. Also, Biden did impose 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. So it was a little bit of a softening, but overall more of the same. This is not too surprising. Both political parties have taken the stance that China is unfairly subsidizing its industries and has closed its market to U.S. goods. And given the remedies that a government has at its disposal, it is not surprising that the policies were continued, and I expect will continue for the foreseeable future.
Got it. Has it been just a China focus, or is there anything you can point to in any of the other countries? I'm particularly interested in the kind of the ally piece, and if I'm a long-term U.S. ally, how should I be feeling today?
Almost like you're viewing a rerun is my suspicion. That also depends on what existing trade agreements are in place, what the balance of trade is looking like. If you think about countries, some countries are poised for great economic gain and opportunity. And specifically, Mexico comes to mind. Mexico has still space to expand its labor force, and there's a lot of Chinese foreign direct investment coming into Mexico in anticipation of being able to take Chinese expertise, capital, brands, and the ability to manage factories and manufacturing operations and run manufacturing operations close to the U.S. Under the protection of free trade agreements. Mexico being an ally, if you ask specifically about the allies, I think that they're the ones that have the most to look forward to. Some other countries that have been in conflict or worried about China, notably Australia, probably will also see a change and a shift Whether that will be more internationalization or them being left more to solve problems on their own, we don't yet know.
Do you think that there's just a general shift toward protectionism for all countries, or is it just something that the U.S. is looking to reallocate itself and to maybe not be as open as it once was?
I think we are seeing a general shift towards protectionism globally. And this trend already existed in a lot of economies, as anybody who's tried to import into Japan, into Korea, into China can tell you, these were not markets that were universally open to foreign companies. They often came with constraints and strings attached that made it very, very difficult to import into those countries. So people have been protecting their industries because they don't see the quid pro quo coming, by which there was comparative advantage at work and both countries benefiting from trade. At the same time as there's been, I won't call it deindustrialization, but a move away from certain manufacturing jobs into service jobs, a lot of countries are seeing that their ability to manufacture certain goods is essentially eroded, and that they are dependent on international trade to secure things that they deem essential for their economy. In the U.S., for example, it is now virtually impossible to make certain kinds of magnetic parts that are essential for making electric motors for automobiles. Those have to come in largely from China. The U.S. has slapped anti-dumping and countervailing duties on those of 200 to 300%, and it's still cheaper to buy them from China with those kinds of duties than it is to buy them in the U.S. because we just no longer have the manufacturing base and the capacity to build them.
Wow, that's a fascinating. I wasn't aware of that, and so, obviously there's a huge focus on tariffs and those sorts of things, and part of the question is going to be, at what point does the tariff not actually do something, right? If I were to say, hey, we're gonna increase the tax on those magnets by 400% or 500%, at what point do you start to see things shift and work well? Because at some point, if you either don't have the capacity or your product is just so much better, people are willing to pay more for that than they would have in the past.
So if a market is truly liquid and you raise prices in one area, people will ultimately buy them. For example, by imposing tariffs, people will find alternate sources. The issue with manufacturing is that it's complex, it's hard, it's capital intensive. In order to build a factory to manufacture specialized magnets or to manufacture any kind of specialized item that requires knowledge of process, specialized machine tools, if you're dealing in the U.S., environmental permitting, all kinds of regulations, is just hard and long. You're not going to be able to quickly set up a factory in 6 months to do any kind of complex manufacturing. You can't even order the machine tools in 6 months in most cases in order to do this. So you can slap on the tariffs and that will eventually generate a reaction. But if the reaction is purely based on tariffs, does that necessarily incent a company to go and start producing something? What happens if the tariffs go away? Are they then no longer going to be competitive? Are they only competitive when there's high tariffs? So it's a bit of a mixed bag, and call it economic dirigisme, where you try and guide the economy, can work, but it can also backfire in spectacular ways.
Or what are some ways that you think it could backfire?
Well, looking at China's, China, for example, decided that they first wanted to learn how to make automotive parts, and they became a global supplier of automotive parts. Then, starting about 10 years ago, they started producing cars for export, and they've since become the world's largest exporter of cars. China has seen they promoted this industrial policy, right? Let's get into the automobile business. And the policy worked decently as long as the people in China who needed to buy a car had not yet bought a car, or if there were large subsidies on cars where people were essentially buying cars below the cost of production. Now that China has had this, their demand for cars immediately met, and the subsidies are being withdrawn, they found out that they have massive overcapacity that the state has largely paid for, and they're trying to export their way out of this into other economies. The problem is that, look at what's happened in the EU recently. The EU decided, without having any of the industry participants file a complaint, to open an investigation into China's anti-competitive practices. And the EU commissioner has come in and said, we're going to investigate this because we don't allow this at home and we aren't going to tolerate it from abroad. So while they may have decided to create an industrial policy to foster production of cars, in the end, they've deployed more capital than can reasonably be used in the global car market. It's likely to make prices come falling down. It's going to have unintended consequences with trade partners, be it the US, the EU. A lot of places are already going to react to this and say, we won't share technology with you anymore. And people are slapping 100% tariffs on cars, even at the manufacturing prices they have. It's going to bring the cost back up. So you ultimately have a lot of wasted capital, a lot of wasted energy that could have been spent on other things going into that. It's a bit of a tricky backfiring.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is something that plays out over decades. This isn't something that's going to happen in any one administration or Communist Party term. So moving back to a second Trump administration, what are generally the objectives for tax and customs and all those things that could be impacting supply chains?
So I think if we look back on Trump's campaign promises and policies in his first term and his campaign promises in the second term, broadly we can say that it includes two things: reducing taxes and using tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the US. The hope being that this will increase US economic activity and ultimately tax revenues and repatriate high-paying jobs. This would take some time to unfold, as you don't build factories and train skilled workers overnight, as we discussed a little bit earlier. So also, while lowering taxes is popular, you need to make up the revenue. So if you're going to lower the taxes, we're going to be looking for other sources of revenue. And increased import duties, which are de facto a tax on consumption, like a federal sales tax or a uniform sales tax almost, come in to raise revenue. So I think we're going to see a reduction in taxes and an increase in alternative sources of revenue, specifically tariffs.
How high would tariffs have to be to offset a massive tax cut? Higher than they're expecting, right?
Way higher, and it would go to the point that we're probably still going to be deficit funding a lot of things for a while, put it that way. I don't see the tax cuts being easily offset. As one thing to remember about things like tariffs and consumption taxes, they fall on people who typically have the lowest ability to pay for them. So if you increase the cost of buying goods and services to people in the bottom 20% of the economy by even 10-15%, for them, this is crippling. If you increase it by 10-15% for people who call it are broadly in the middle class, it's a very, very significant impact because they consume more things than they tend to save or reinvest just by the nature of the amount of money that they have and your general cost of maintaining living, paying for your mortgage, paying for your kids' school clothes, things like that. All these things would be impacted by increased tariffs.
Got it. Okay.
So it's difficult to say. And then there's another piece of legislation that, although it was part of the Biden administration where it was enacted, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, looks set for an increased enforcement. And this was obviously enacted under Biden in 2021. But if you look back, this was a key point of interest for the first Trump administration. And I believe it was Mike Pompeo even designated the treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population in China as a genocide. So we've already seen budget allocations be increased for this under Biden. And my understanding is that we're going to see increased enforcement and increased budget for this going forward.
Got it. And what were some of the things that they were doing, other than I know that you had to go back and kind of trace and understand where your cotton was coming from in most cases, and you had to confirm that it wasn't coming from there. So it was kind of dissuading people from sourcing cotton from China in general. What are some of the parts of this law that you think will ratchet up the pressure a little bit?
So they've been expanding the items as there's been a shift in where people are alleging there is Uyghur population forced labor being used. There's an increase in the number of commodities that are being included. Vinyl floor tile, for example, has been pretty heavily targeted. Solar obviously was a big issue because of the polysilicon. So you're seeing an increase in the commodities being targeted, and you're seeing an increase in the regions from which they come. Also, if you look into forced labor, is not uniquely a Chinese issue.
Right.
It is estimated that there are 7 to 10 million people who are working under forced labor, or sometimes called modern slavery conditions in the world today. If you look at most of the withhold release orders and interventions on the part of the US government, the majority of them are not coming from China. China is way down there. Last I checked, Malaysia and Vietnam were the #1 countries. So you're seeing an expansion of this law because the government is concerned that goods that were produced in the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Xinjiang are being then shipped to other neighboring countries and being manufactured. So there's been a general enhancement or expansion of the countries about which this is being enforced that wasn't initially anticipated.
Interesting. So the UFLPA could apply to goods coming out of Vietnam or Malaysia. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Even in theory, even goods that are being produced in Mexico, is that there's so much transshipment going on of goods that it's very, very hard to determine where things actually come from. So this traceability requirement is going to expand to other countries, and it's just sort of becoming a bit of a best practice for especially larger, more organized players, but probably increasingly for smaller companies.
Gotcha. So in other words, this law is forcing people to take a look at their supply chain, and it almost feels like it could be a backdoor to getting people to get out of China, even on like a tier 2 or tier 3 level, because if I understand it correctly, the aim or the initial intent of it was to protect a minority population in China, and therefore kind of also be a bit divisive with China. And so if we're saying that we're now going to be looking at goods coming from Mexico or Vietnam being subject to this level of transparency, then it effectively just becomes a bigger battle line to say, hey, don't have anything coming from China, even if it's your supplier. Do I have that right?
I think you've sort of nailed it. This is a place where trade policy is dovetailing perfectly with human rights policy. And you can expect to see more enforcement. And it's not only UFLPA that's pushing for this visibility and understanding of supply chains. There's separate legislation in California. In the EU, you've got legislation in Germany, legislation in France, you got legislation in Canada. Ex-US, the legislation has considerably less teeth than it does in the US, but you're seeing similar pushes in lots of places. The EU decided to take a stance on traceability, which is much softer. They often let the US lead some of the more aggressive positions in the world. Sort of historically, it's been a thing. But yeah, you're seeing the same trends globally with the same concerns about human rights, but also about supply chain integrity and about also protecting your own industries.
Yeah.
The easiest way to make sure that you do not have Xinjiang cotton in your garments in the US is to buy American cotton. But unfortunately, all the American cotton is sold out. You can't easily procure cotton or manufacturing capacity for garments in the US right now.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you think that this is really about human rights, or is it more about protectionism and economic policy with the veil of human rights?
Well, let's not be controversial. It's possible for multiple things to be playing on at once. Part of the US's core ethos is that it is the land of the free. And yes, has that maybe been overused as a marketing slogan almost for internally and externally? Maybe. But this is part of the identity of the US citizenry, and it's something that in general, the great majority of people in the US agree is extremely important. So is it a policy that resonates in general with the American populace and one that is top of mind for them? And let's remember that the US itself had a long history of slavery. And this is, again, it's a controversial point within internal US politics. And seeing that abroad is generally recognized as being a universally bad thing. As people come to understand the nature of what's going on, as NGOs give more of a description of what's going on in various parts of the world, I think we're going to see the human rights aspect of it be more commonly understood. And in the same way that child labor caused some serious headaches for companies like Nike a while back, I think we're going to start to see the people be increasingly aware of the plight of people who are really held in captivity. And by the way, let's not single out China here. There are palm oil plantations where people have their passports taken away and are kept in dormitories. And you go and you see a 5-story dormitory on which there's bars on the windows all the way up. That's not to keep people from getting in on the 5th floor.
Right.
So that there are conditions that exist that are unconscionable and not compatible with the view that Americans have of themselves within the world and our national identity as American citizens. So a bit of a long answer, but there is a human rights aspect to this. It is a legitimate concern. That it also happens to dovetail very, very elegantly with current trade policy and protectionism. Might be by design. And if you want to, there was an exemption to importing things made with forced labor if there was no producer in the US up until 2021. That exemption has now been removed. So it's a bit of both, right? There's a bit of nuance going on, but almost everybody who looks at this has to ask themselves how much of it is trade policy, how much of it's human rights policy.
Yeah, no, you make such a good point, and it certainly is not a China-only problem. It happens everywhere, and I would say there's probably places in America that are close to looking at this forced labor sort of thing as well. I think that one of the things that people talked about with global trade or free trade was the idea that if we engage with these countries, that the economic activity that we were having would spur an adoption of human rights or values. We were gonna work with them, but we were gonna give them all these strings attached. And it seems that over the last 25 years, that experiment has to some extent failed, either in the sense that people have not changed the way that we thought they were going to be, or we've decided that, like, hey, we really like the stuff being a lot cheaper than it could be. And so I guess the question I have for you is, as we see this trend toward protectionism, to what extent is the US or the West in general going to be able to exert its values and try to be able to say, hey, this is how we want you to act when we work with you, if we're kind of closing off a little bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's a really, really good question, and it plays into protectionism and isolationism in general. My read on the world is that we are moving increasingly away from a globalized system in which there's a view of positive sum relationships between nations and all nations normalizing on certain values. And you could broadly call these the values of classical liberalism, right? Individual rights, protection of contracts and property, due process, rule of law rather than by law. All these ideas have taken a bit of a hit in the past decade. And I think that we're going to continue to see that occur. I don't think that our policies are going to have much of an impact on which sovereign nations run their process unless they have a very, very strong incentive to be long-term integrated with the post-World War II US-led world order. If you were China, you now have a big enough economy, and if the US decides not to trade with you anymore, you'll trade with South America, you'll trade with Africa, you'll trade with much of Asia, you'll trade with India, or you'll trade with the newest client state, Russia. There's too many options, and while there may have been the possibility to influence things 25 years ago, at this point in time, If you go to Chile or Argentina, like I did this past August, the majority of new vehicles being sold are coming in from China. They have a market for their goods. There's a willingness to take them on without imposing conditions. And China is usually not only the low cost seller, but they've also gotten to be so good at producing things that are no longer produced elsewhere in the world. Unless you're willing to deal with inferior goods, it's very, very hard to get around dealing with China in a lot of areas. So I don't see the goals of people in the European Union or North America really impacting the way people behave in other countries at this point.
That's a great take. So much of what people have talked about and what we've talked about is the impact of tariffs on the global economy that we could expect from a second Trump administration. But there's so much more beyond that. And so I'm wondering if the administration were to get really aggressive and they were to look at changing some structural things beyond tariffs, what sorts of things come to mind that they could change? So I'm thinking like de minimis seems like it's something that could be ripe for being scrapped, potentially uniform sales tax for e-commerce, repeal of renegotiation of free trade agreements. I mean, what sticks out to you as we all know that tariffs are going to happen, but what are those next big things that if they were feeling really emboldened by winning the popular vote and now looking like they're going to control both houses of Congress, they could go after?
Well, let's start by one thing that's probably not specific to the Trump administration and would probably have happened in any administration. And it was my read, and that is the erosion, if not the elimination, of the de minimis exemption. So this is the exemption by which goods entering the U.S. underneath $800 per person per day are not subject to duties. It used to be that collecting $5 or $6 of duties was just cost prohibitive, right? You were going to have people mail you checks, add them in at origin. It was just going to be very, very hard to collect, and getting people to process the documentation necessary to assess that was just really, really difficult. These days, with most commerce being electronic, in particular e-commerce, you have a commercial invoice and an assessment of what's coming in. You got payment records of what's been paid by the consumer in the US. You've got the ability to track what the value of goods is in a relatively automated way. My suspicion, we're going to see an end, or at least a massive lowering of the de minimis threshold. If you just think about the amount of money it's going to bring in, I think last year we came up to, was it 1.2 billion parcels coming into the US?
It was
the majority of it coming in from China. Was that the number?
That sounds right. That sounds right.
Imagine slapping on average $5 in duties on 1.2 billion. You come up with $6 billion. That's starting to be a meaningful amount of money. If you then also look at the proposals to put on a $2 per package security assessment fee, that can sort of bootstrap your enforcement budget, your technology buys. So I think we're going to see an erosion of that. And we wouldn't be the first country to do it. The EU got rid of all that in 2021. And these days, if you import a $10 package into the EU, you're going to have to pay a duty bill, which is going to be actually quite steep, because you've got to cover FedEx's or DHL's cost of administering that. So you may be paying $8 on a $10 package. But they've managed to do it. They figure out how to do it, and DHL will send you the invoice, and you'll pay the invoice, and it's been done. Canada lowered their de minimis value a while back. I believe it's right now at $40 Canadian if you're coming from the US or Mexico, and $20 for the rest of the world. So this is something that's been done. It's been a while coming. People have proven it can be done, and I don't think that the administration will particularly look kindly to people avoiding tariff laws by using de minimis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I completely agree with you. And if we think about bringing jobs back to the U.S., there's a lot of investment that's happened in warehouses on either side of the border just to do basic fulfillment, right, for 321. And so there could be thousands of jobs there that would be moving elsewhere that would be there. So I could definitely see that being something in their toolkit. Anything else come to mind?
So you mentioned free trade agreements and most favored nation. I think that we're going to see a lot of those renegotiated, and that they may be expanded. Free trade agreements are a tool of foreign policy. It's a way to reward the people you like doing business with, and alternatively punish the people you don't like doing business with. So my suspicion is that we're going to see expansion and of free trade agreements within the U.S.'s backyard. So into Latin America, expansion possibly of CAFTA. That's something I'm expecting to see, and it's going to be interesting. It's in the U.S.'s interest to bring into the fold and have tighter trade relations with people who are essentially in the backyard, if you will.
I guess that makes sense, because if you're lowering trade barriers across the board, free trade agreements don't mean as much. But if you're increasing barriers, even not just tariffs, but quotas and other things like that, then it is something where these free trade agreements actually mean something, and there's a real value, and you're probably going to be able to steer even more commerce to those countries. So I think that's a smart take. Let's talk about the impact of the election on everybody not in the U.S. And so, if you are in the Chinese or Mexican or Indian trade ministry, how are you feeling this week? And what do you think the impact is likely to be there?
If I'm in Mexico, I am cautiously optimistic. And I say cautiously because you just have to put a caveat in front of it. But if I'm in Mexico, I'm optimistic. Again, as we were discussing earlier, there's a lot of manufacturing expertise and money in China looking for market expansion. And one way to do this is to expand into other countries that have free trade agreements with the US. The issue is that they want a little bit more flexibility than dealing with US regulation, and they're going to want lower labor costs than are available in the US. And Mexico is the natural recipient of that investment. So if I'm sitting in Mexico, I'm looking at it really, really expanding my industrial manufacturing base. And importantly, not expanding it with low skill manufacturing. We're now talking about bringing in things that may have very, very high skill manufacturing and will add to Mexico's knowledge base and expertise. Automobile manufacturing, solar panels, all kinds of technology manufacturing that may now be done in Mexico to benefit from the free trade agreement. And let's not forget that Mexico also shares borders with the US. So your cost of trade, your cost of actually moving goods from Mexico into the US is much, much lower than dealing with either air or ocean from Asia. And also just takes much less time.
Do one of the things that I've always heard as a criticism of Mexico is there's always this potential. And, we've talked about Mexico becoming America's factory floor for 40 years, 50 years, and it never has quite happened because of infrastructure or government, things like that. Is there a world where you could see a Trump administration saying, all right, we'll clean up the border? That's like a of course, that's a thing that they have to tick off their to-do list. But if we really are serious about reshoring, could you see a similar sort of Belt and Road initiative where we're building out more infrastructure in these pipelines of manufacturing coming into the U.S.? Or is it something where, the administration would likely take the opposite effect and say, we know that people are going to try to go to Mexico, but we're going to still make it so difficult for you to come in that, we want those jobs in Texas, not in Monterrey?
Let's unpack that, because you mentioned something like a Belt and Road initiative, which was China's very ambitious attempt to build out infrastructure that would connect the world to the Chinese manufacturing engine. Given how globalized production of, just to take an example of an American car, what you perceive of as a made in USA car is made with parts that come from around the world. And a lot of time you're seeing parts that get shuttled from Canada to then be once processed in Mexico. Then the same part will go but from Mexico into the US, where it will be reprocessed. It'll go back to Mexico. So you're seeing expanding the network would probably make the entire North American bloc more economically competitive, self-reliant, and resilient. I would love to see that. I think it would be good for the US. I think it would be good for Canada. I think it would be good for Mexico. I think it would help provide more economic opportunities also down into Central America and may reduce the incentive for people to leave countries that are in economically dire circumstances, even though a lot of them, well, in any case, it may reduce that incentive.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think if we were to do that, that would be amazing for the North American economy and would really bulletproof this, because I think Mexico and Canada, are appendages to the U.S. economy in many ways. And so the question would be, would the Trump administration see this as something that's like, yeah, let's go do it, let's be bold and do this? Or is it something where we're like, we don't want that at all. We want all of those jobs and all of that commerce in the U.S. because we no longer believe in trading partners the same way that we did 20 years ago.
I think you're going to have a little bit of both. Obviously, belief in trading partners in the way that it used to be believed in has been severely eroded, and Donald Trump has not been generally a big fan of global trade. When it comes to if you look into USMCA or CAMUSA, as it's called where you live now, I'm not sure what the name is in Mexico, but it's probably Mecumasa or something like that. But if you look into that, there are pretty strict rules about the labor conditions under which things need to be produced, which to make it marginally cheaper to produce in Mexico, but not in the way that it would be cheaper if you didn't have any regulation. I believe last I looked, and don't quote me on this, but I think that auto parts made in Mexico needed to be produced with labor that was being paid $21 an hour to be eligible for USMCA entry with zero duties. It's been a while since I've checked. It's just a number I have off the top of my head. So yes, would people want the jobs to be in the U.S. economy, in the territorial U.S.? I think that the administration would. The issue is we don't have the labor. We are already at record low unemployment numbers. And expanding our economy is not only about increasing the number of jobs in the U.S., but about increasing the value of the productive assets in the U.S. by tying them into other producers, other neighbors, other people you like to do business with. It just makes everything in the U.S. more valuable. I mean, one of our chief exports in the world is intellectual property, engineering, product design, call it broadly technology, right? Look on the back of your Apple product box. It's like designed in California, made in China. I don't know about you, but I don't get the impression Apple is in any kind of financial trouble from doing business with China. You might say that doesn't apply to like a broader economy, but the U.S. as a center of creation of expertise and research benefits from having manufacturing partners that allow us to essentially grow our economy by shifting things and sort of extending our manufacturing backyard. And again, there's been some erosion of that perspective in the past few years, but
yeah. No, it's a very interesting piece, and maybe that's a discussion for another day of what would it need to look like, and what would a deal have to resemble in order for the right to feel comfortable about the border and feel like they're not rewarding Mexico for letting all these people through, but at the same time really being able to have a strategic impact there. But we've talked about kind of the bull case with Mexico. Obviously, if I'm in China, I'm probably not feeling as optimistic. How do you think the Chinese are going to respond to Trump 2.0?
If I'm sitting in China, it's going to take a lot of courage to put on a big smile right now. China has internal problems that are difficult to overcome. Their domestic consumption never recovered from COVID. Youth unemployment is running very, very high. And for kids that have spent the past 10, sometimes 15 years just working brutally to get through school to then not be able to find jobs is got to be really, really discouraging. This real estate crisis is quite literally decimating people's personal savings. If you need liquidity and all of your money is in real estate right now, you are really not in a good mood. And the Chinese government understands that the people not being in a good mood is, having a knock-on effect, and people aren't spending on services. They're shifting their consumption, right? The wealthier people are still consuming because they have that extra margin. But a lot of the country is really in the doldrums. And the state-led economic policy has led to overcapacity in certain domains. Automobiles notably being one. China has not increased the number of automobiles that they sold versus 5 years ago. They've just had to start importing them because people aren't buying them in China anymore. Because if you got a car, if you wanted a car, needed one, you already bought one, kind of a thing. So they're trying to export their way and utilize all the capital that they've got expended in their industrial base by exporting their way out of their troubles. But this is causing some trouble with trade partners who used to be fairly happy to do business with them and with whom there's a fair amount of bilateral trade. Said that the European Commission, for the first time that I know of, has instituted a large anti-competitive study into the Chinese automotive sector. And it used to be that cars went from Europe to China, especially in the premium section, but also knowledge went from Europe to China. And now we're seeing sort of a breakdown of that. So I think that their economic prospects in the favor of increased trade barriers and a group of people who are going to make it increasingly difficult to do business with them, as the EU is likely to follow the trend of what is done in the US, as it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for German politicians to explain why they haven't raised tariffs if the US has, while German industry is suffering a general decline and the Chinese are no longer buying the high-value machine tool parts that they used to buy when they were building up their factory infrastructure. So if I'm in China, I'm feeling a little bit worried right now.
Okay. That's to be expected. So I think one thing that there's been a lot of day one promises that you've heard of, and I think a lot of people are maybe under the impression that, come January 20th, the inauguration's at noon, come 1 p.m., everything's kind of changed and tariffs are going up to 60% and all those sorts of things. What do you think is the likelihood that there will be changes on day one versus all of this conversation being more a negotiation tactic? I mean, I remember in the first Trump administration, he campaigned on the idea of killing NAFTA, right? And just getting rid of that completely. But he ended up renegotiating and rebranding it. And so do you expect there to be a similar sort of track this year where when he says 60% tariffs, it's really 10? And he's just kind of ready to do a bunch of deals and update things, and that's really what we should be expecting? Or do you think that businesses should be planning on, come into January, the world's very changed, and so you need to be massively buying inventory now and acting as if things are very different then?
So I think that your point about how there's a negotiation that needs to take place, if you walk into the room and you open your negotiation by imposing your strictest potential remedy or sanction, it doesn't leave you much room to maneuver, and it doesn't leave other people time to come and try and meet with you, right? So you can try that, right? You can try the scorched earth negotiating policy. I think the president-elect prides himself on being a negotiator. It's part of his brand. And I suspect that he's going to come in and allow people to, A, wonder what's going to happen, and B, open up discussions. And probably I think he's going to hope that people come to him before he goes to them, as it's usually a stronger position when people come to you rather than you having to go ask them for terms, so to speak. So I don't think we're going to see day one tariff increases. I think they'll be discussed. The mechanisms they might start the wheels of government rolling to put them in place, but I think it's going to take a little bit of time to happen. If you look at the first administration, he did campaign on the tariffs, but it took almost 2.5, 3 years before they went into effect, if I recall. So there was a little bit of a lag.
But then once they were there, he was really good at getting on Twitter and changing stuff. So Maybe
Yeah,
he's got the muscle memory there for it. Um,
yeah, you might. You remember there was part of the negotiation involved China buying more goods.
right.
It was an additional 200 billion. I think it was 200 billion, and that quota was not met. So you could say part of that was due to the pandemic and a general slowdown in commerce that occurred, but certainly goods coming into the U.S. from China did not slow down. Um, so I suspect that just based on that negotiation might come back up, and that there's going to be a few rounds. That being said, putting certainly discussing them as being a very, very high priority is probably the case, and I think we should anticipate all of us to see an increase in the cost of imported goods as new tariffs go into effect.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's day one or day 700.
Yeah, well, and that kind of gets us to the trillion-dollar question: is if I'm a business, whether I'm a big business or a small business, how do I need to prepare for this? I mean, it is possible to overcorrect and overreact and put yourself in a difficult situation. It's also possible to, wish that you had made some decisions months later, right? And so, from your perspective, what are those sorts of things that are prudent things for businesses to be planning on today, and what sorts of things would you think maybe you should wait on and see where things fall?
All right. Short answer: to prepare for potential tariff increases, consider stockpiling essential goods. If there are things that you cannot do business without, and you can buy them right now at a known cost, and you've got a profitable business and you've got excess cash, that's sort of a no-brainer in many ways. You mentioned that you don't want to overreact. So I think you need to bring in your procurement team, your sales teams, and your finance teams to really assess your inventory needs. And keep in mind that the cost of goods may rise. Again, if you've got cash on your balance sheet, this can be a pretty straightforward process. I've spoken to people this week who have discussed, for certain items, even tapping into credit lines, which, given today's interest rates, is a risky calculation.
Yeah,
But again,
that's
if your business margins allow for it, and if you got predictable consumption, then that could make sense. Another thing is, during previous tariff hikes, people started stockpiling goods. This drives up demand for shipping and higher freight costs as companies sort of rush to build up inventory. So starting early could help mitigate that and ensure that you've got supply continuity. I don't think we're going to see a situation like we had in 2020 where the ports just sort of froze up for a while, but I don't think any company wants to go through that headache again with just wondering if they're going to be able to get stuff in and out of ports because of capacity constraints again.
Yeah, hopefully not.
Yeah, but then there's another thing. A lot of these, the whole point of the Trump tariff policy is to encourage people to look at alternative suppliers. So while he would prefer that they be in the U.S., presumably countries with which there are free trade agreements are also good places to look. So you really want to be able to diversify your supplier base anyway for a variety of reasons. We discovered during the pandemic, if you had a single source supplier and they're on the other side of the world and their country gets shut down, you were being put out of business until you can find another supplier, which could take you, finding a supplier that meets your quality needs, can deliver on things is hard. During the pandemic, we spoke with people who would have paid almost anything to get goods made. They would have paid double, triple what they were paying before, but you just simply couldn't find it. It wasn't like you could visit China to go and visit a new factory, negotiate something, right? You were sort of stuck. And as we see a general increase in trade volatility, I think really building resilient supply chains and looking for reliable options for alternative suppliers is another thing that needs to be done and should have been done 4 years ago. But if you haven't already engaged in that, now's probably a good time to revisit it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that, my take from this conversation as I've been thinking over things the last couple of days is that, there was this broader trend that was happening toward regionalization, decoupling, reglobalization, whatever you want to call it. And basically the second Trump administration is going to be an accelerant toward that trend. And so it used to be that anytime you were going to produce something, if you had an idea for a product, the default answer that you put very little thought into was China, right? I'm just going to go there. I'm going to find somebody on Alibaba, and there we go. And now what I think is going to happen, and what every company should be doing, is taking a first principles approach to procurement and thinking about this and saying, what do I really value, right? Who could produce this? How could cost change? What's the distance to my customer, which I think is a bigger thing. Like holding less inventory and being reactive to your customer is probably a bigger thing for an argument in favor of Mexico than even the tariffs, in my opinion. But I see this as something where every company should go through and just reassess white canvas. If I were to start this business over today, where would my distribution points be? Where would my factories be? And how would I put things together now?
I think you're dead on. It's time for a strategic reevaluation of your procurement, of your supply chain, and you sort of don't really have a choice now.
No, you either need to think. It's an opportunity for procurement professionals to prove what they're worth, right? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite quotes is a Swedish proverb that says, "Every ship has a good captain in calm weather." And we're now entering, some rough seas from a procurement perspective. And the fact that the Biden administration did not roll back this trend, that they kept the tariffs or increased the tariffs, suggests to me that this is not going to go away in 4 years. This is now the course for the next 20 years. And so it's something where we've got to go back to basics and think about what are those right partners, what are those right areas and circumstances that get there. And, government policy will shift and you'll adapt to that. But I think even if there wasn't these massive tariffs that are coming through, it's time for companies to start thinking about things from a first principle approach and starting over.
Yeah. So. Which is probably a good exercise in general, right? There's just the pace of technological change that we've seen in the US in terms of information technology may lead to new abilities within industry to go in and undertake exercises that before you might have done once every 4, 5, 6 years, you could now do more quickly. And I'm, of course, talking about the use of AI just to do modeling. The exercise that before took 40 hours of work now takes 6. So yeah. Why not do things more iteratively, more quickly, and try and be a little bit more nimble?
Yeah, completely. Lots of stuff changing, so it's a good chance to reset. Chris, thank you so much for giving some of your time and sharing your thoughts. I've learned a lot. I hope our viewers have as well. If they want to continue the conversation with you, what's the right way for them to reach out to you?
Send me an email, C like Charlie, W like a wall at ZeusLogics.com, or reach out to me on LinkedIn.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll do this again soon.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. It's been great.